We're a couple of minutes from getting validated. If you haven't grabbed I think we're ready. All right, hang on. All right, folks. Good evening and welcome to the members of the Alamo Citizens Advisory Committee. Tonight we are here for our continuing series on the content discussion. So tonight we're talking about the Battle of the Alamo through three lenses: perspectives, choices, and motivations. So I will turn it over to our Tri-Chair, Sue Ann Pemberton, to give us our welcome for the evening. Ms. Penderman.
Thank you, and good evening. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Sue Ann Pemberton, one of the Tri-Chairs for the Alamo Citizens Advisory Committee. On behalf of my fellow Tri-Chairs, Rebecca Villagran and Aranetta Pierce, we welcome you. I'd also like to recognize the Alamo Trust Executive Director, Kate Rogers, and Assistant City Manager, Lori Houston. Our interpretive and museum consultants from PGAV Destinations and Gallagher and Associates are also here to listen to these presentations. This is our third content discussion for the summer. Tonight we will be learning about the Battle of the Alamo through those three lenses: perspectives, choices, and motivations. As a reminder, the schedule of meetings is available on the city's website, and the agendas are posted. The next meeting will be on July 13th, and we will discuss the history of unfree labor at and around the Alamo. It'll be live streamed at 5:30. Colonel Alan Huffines was planning to give us an introduction to the topic tonight and to moderate the panel. But unfortunately, he could not be here. Luckily, he is a member of our committee, so we will have access to his expertise at a later date. But now I'd like to introduce another committee member, Forrest Bias, to give us a brief introduction to the topic and to introduce our speakers. Forrest?
Thank you, Sue Ann. Since Colonel Huffines couldn't be here, he passed along his notes so I could read you his introduction. I want to say also real quick, Colonel Huffines is a multi-decorated veteran of Desert Storm and an airborne ranger. Good evening, gentles. I know we are all comfortable and eager here in Alamo Hall, but a reminder that all of us sit where men died. A Mexican column attacked right here on this very spot, only to be eviscerated by the defenders' church battery. Later that morning, fugitive defenders attempting to escape to the Gonzales Road, which we know as Commerce Street, were likewise hors de combat by the lances and carbines of the Dolores Cavalry Regiment reinforced. If you must pick a side in this fight, know now that men's blood, Anglo and Hispanic, were spilled here in buckets. That blood now commingles beneath our feet. It's an odd-looking set of buildings, a single-story convento and a broken church with a Moorish Taco Bell facade that is recognizable globally. So much so that the humps are an integral part of the copyright of the current management of the place. But in its plainness, there is beauty and some form of magnetism. A tragedy, a defeat, and a victory all occurred here. A sound defeat of the Texians and Tejano defenders, courtesy of the victorious soldados of President General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna's Vanguard Brigade of the Mexican Division of the North. The Alamo is not only history, but also creation myth. It is a religion, a willing sacrificial death. There are sacred texts, patriarchs, a trinity, a Madonna, and a Christ child, all overcoming a lesser Satan in the almost anagram Santa Anna. It also becomes a search for a holy land nested within a David and Goliath framework with Texians and Tejanos succored in their adobe and rock tabernacle, whilst other tribesmen draft the new God-given Decalogue in Washington town. But that's not exactly true, is it? In fact, it could be considered blasphemous. How fair is it to burden their weary souls with a sense of perfection that didn't exist among them or among us? The Alamo is the last stand narrative. There are other last stands in history: the Hot Gates, Cameroon, Wake Island, Masada, Khyber Pass, and Saragari come to mind. And each nation and people are justly proud of their particular sacrifice on the battlefield. But there is a difference. With few exceptions, those last stands were fought by professional soldiers who had the unity of esprit, training and duty to bind them. Not so with our sad stones of the Alamo, where the defenders spake different languages, practiced different religions, and had cultural ties and accents spreading from Rhode Island to the Rio Guadalupe at least. Colonists of a decade or less mixed with native-born Tejanos who had no living family memory or experience outside of Texas, and Mexico was further away in many ways than the 13 colonies from the Great Britain. The defenders had no commonality of professionalism, certainly no martial discipline or esprit. The defenders' connectivity was a reliance upon self, family, and nonconformity to tyranny. In their minds, that was duty and that was enough. Honor was a debt they owed their friends and family, their word. Sacrifice was the very cornerstone of the religion they had been raised with, and it was vital to their sense of self that if ever cornered, not to back down. The Mexican Army of the North brought with it trained soldiery and European experienced officers, along with engineers, artillery, supply trains, and experience. They must have stormed through the Alamo defenders like a wolf through sheep. They knew that God is always on the side of the bigger battalions. Now the Alamo is grudgingly marching into the 21st century. We must emancipate the Alamo from the myth. The Alamo plan will finally build the world-class museum the site deserves, and these content discussions will help us tell the full layered story of the Alamo in its 300-year history. Tonight's discussion will examine the Battle of the Alamo through three lenses: perspectives, choices, and motivations. Bios for our speakers were sent out in advance, and I hope everyone had a chance to look at them. Dr. James Crisp and Dr. Bruce Winders will discuss the perspectives, choices, and motivations leading up to the siege and Battle of 1836. Dr. James Crisp is Professor Emeritus of History at North Carolina State University. He is an award-winning author, and his next book, Inside the Texas Revolution, The Enigmatic Memoir of Herman Ehrenberg, is scheduled to be published next month. Dr. Bruce Winders is an internationally recognized authority on the conflicts over the American Southwest fought between the United States and Mexico in the 19th century. He served as a historian and curator for the Alamo for 23 years. First, we will hear from Melissa Simmons with PJAV Destinations about how tonight's discussion aligns with the vision and guiding principles created by this committee. Melissa?
Good evening. I'm pleased to join you for our conversation tonight on the Battle of the Alamo through three lenses: perspectives, choices, and motivations. We could easily devote a whole series of content discussions to the Battle of 1836, and that probably still wouldn't cover all of the stories. So tonight, we will be viewing history through three lenses as a way to think more broadly about events leading up to and during the siege and Battle of 1836. Seeing the battle from multiple perspectives reveals historic events from different points of view, allowing us to see a more complete picture of events. First-hand accounts and primary sources, such as letters, provide context and insight into the emotions and motivations of those moments in history. This kind of evidence is crucial when creating a timeline and an understanding of events in a sequence, especially how they interrelate and how choices made by one person affected others. Taken together, all three lenses, perspectives, choices, and motivations, provide insight into a very real history and allow us to view it as if it were happening in real time. In order to understand perspectives, we must look at personal accounts. Some of the people who were there to witness events recorded their perspectives onto paper, creating some of the most compelling artifacts we have today. We look to these sources as the main way of understanding history, but they are not necessarily a completely factual retelling of history. Rather, they are events seen through one person's eyes. When you add up multiple perspectives, especially from opposing sides or differing locations, we can begin to get a broader picture of history. If we look at the letters sent out from the Alamo during the siege in 1836, we see events from a limited point of view. Written in the moment, many letters speak of the garrison's morale while also pleading for help in the defense against a much larger force. From the journals and letters of the Mexican troops surrounding the Alamo, we can understand the strategy of entrenchments and artillery placements. Santa Anna's orders detail the plan of attack for March 6th, and subsequent documents reveal the flow of the battle. Of the few survivors of the battle, some of their accounts came to us through interviews that may or may not have been embellished by those inscribing them. These eyewitness accounts detail who was there defending the Alamo, and in some instances where they died. Finally, if we look at the perspectives of the residents of Behar, we see the aftermath of the battle and start to understand the social costs of the revolution. Letters and recollections from those who helped to clear the battlefield show the grim picture of destruction and death. Each of these perspectives is important, and each fits into the overall narrative. Through a deeper reading of these accounts, we can start to understand both political and personal motivations as well. Looking at the political landscape of the times, there were many different factions or political groups, both nationally and regionally. As Mexico gained its independence from Spain, two opposing views emerged on how to govern the new nation. On one side, the Federalists supported states' rights and immigration to fill the sparse territory in the north. On the other side, Centralists thought that a ruling elite would best help establish the new nation. The Centralists were opposed to immigration, especially Anglo settlers who brought their American ideals of liberty and freedom with them. These two political factions finally clashed when, in 1834, Santa Anna, then an elected president, changed his political views from Federalist to Centralist and became a dictator, plunging the young country into a civil war. Meanwhile, in Texas, an important question was being asked: to fight or not to fight? War and peace parties were formed in the lead up to the Texas Revolution. Politically or personally motivated, many ultimately chose to fight, sparking revolutionary currents in Texas. Alliance with political factions can help us to clarify a person's political motivations, but there could be a multitude of reasons why the group of defenders ended up at the Alamo. Some were there to fight, others not by choice, and still others wanted to survive. These motivations help to explain the choices made by figures on both sides. Looking back in time, we can see the connections between individual choices and events or their effects. Knowing what we do about the battle, it is interesting to see where the what-ifs might lead. If a different decision was made, could that have changed events? What if Travis hadn't fired the 18-pounder in response to Santa Anna's demand for surrender? What if Santa Anna hadn't divided his forces in the Texas campaign? What if Fannin had indeed marched his 300 men to the Alamo in time for the final battle? While it is fun to speculate what could have happened had those choices been different, we also need to look at and acknowledge those who did not have a choice. Some of the men fighting on both sides weren't there by choice. Slaves, indentured servants, and conscripted soldiers might not have had a chance to opt out of the fighting, instead trying to survive as best they could in the circumstances. The Battle of 1836 is compelling as a story, especially when we look at multiple perspectives, personal motivations, and choices. I think we can all agree that the battle will be the hook that draws visitors to the Alamo. And through it, we can enhance and expand the stories told on site. As stated in the first guiding principle, the 1836 Battle of the Alamo, the most widely recognized event, provides an opportunity to tell the entire history of the Alamo area. We can think of the story of the battle as the shared entry point for visitors to explore more of the Alamo's history. The continuum of time implies that there are no singular events in history. Everything is connected. Things that happened before can provide context to later events, and we can see the effects of those later events on more recent history, even through to today. Including multiple perspectives, personal motivations, and choices in our interpretation of the story of the battle will reveal the personal stories of these historical figures. These personal stories can help visitors and residents connect to the past in meaningful ways and see themselves in the history of the Alamo. As written in the first vision statement, engage local residents and visitors in ways to personally connect to the Alamo area experience. Finding ways to connect with the past isn't easy, but done right, it can be a powerful tool to help visitors find relevance and engage more deeply with historical events and people. Tonight's conversation will just start to scratch the surface of three possible ways of looking at the story of the battle. Each of these can still encompass the entire story, but together they take on new meaning and allow us to think about events in new ways, perhaps even leading to new lines of questioning or research. I hope that you will be inspired to search out more information to complete the stories told here tonight. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Crisp.
Thank you, Mother. Hey, you better clap now, and you might not after I finish. And pardon the reading glasses, but age has caught up with me. If you go to the United States Capitol, every state gets 2 statues for Statuary Hall. Who are the 2 for Texas? They are the 2 men who were most responsible for the beginning and the end, in many ways, of the Texas Revolution, a revolt they did not want to see happen in 1835 when it started. Who are these men? You don't know who the 2 statues are? Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston. If If you go to the Briscoe Center for Texas History at the University of Texas, those same statues and copies are right there, Austin and Houston. Neither one of them wanted a revolt. They both wanted Texas to eventually become part of the United States with time. Stephen Austin said, just like a ripe peach falls off of a tree, in time Texas will fall off of the Mexican tree as developments take place. And as we get more and more men coming in with their families, and he said, with their rifles. So he was thinking about war, but he didn't want war until it was forced on him. And it was forced on him by the commander of the Alamo. He wasn't the commander of the Alamo when he forced it on him. He was William Barrett Travis, hothead, unpopular man, the man who attacked and fortunately peacefully achieved the surrender of the Mexican customs unit at Anahuac on the mouth of the Trinity River on Galveston Bay. That's what got things started. And it's when General Koss and his soldiers came and demanded that not only Travis, the lawbreaker, but Zavala, the opponent, Lorenzo de Zavala, the former chairman of the Mexican Constitutional Convention of 1824, came back from France and didn't go to Mexico proper. He came to Texas because he was now opposing the centralists under Santa Anna. But when Travis's arrest and Zavala's arrest and the arrest of other troublemaking Texans was demanded by the military, that's when the Texans said no, and when they were slowly but surely pushed into a revolt that they absolutely were not ready for. This was not a deep plot to suddenly attack the Mexicans. This was a revolt that they were so unready for. Bruce Winders and I were talking today about how this is a revolt and a war fought by reenactors. How would reenactors fight a battle? Poorly, probably. But these men were not just reenactors in that they were total amateurs. They were reenactors in that they had in their mind what they were doing. And they were, most of them, certainly the Anglos, were thinking not of 1835, they were thinking of 1776. They were thinking about their fathers and grandfathers. And they were thinking about what happens when the military comes in from the center of the country, that is from England to Boston and Savannah and eventually New York City and Yorktown, all of the other battles that took place in the American Revolution, which they consciously invoked and vociferously cited as one of their inspirations. I don't want to leave Navarro and Seguin and those Tejanos of San Antonio out of this, because they read history too. Navarro used words that even his English translators didn't understand. When he talked about ultramontane, he's referring to Catholic papal history and the conservative wing of the Catholic Church, and that's what he's comparing Santa Anna to. And one of his translators referred to ultramontane as over the mountains, a literal translation which it did not mean in Navarro's words. These were men who knew history too. Navarro was the first native-born Texan historian, and he was also the most important leader in this city for 30 or 40 years. So these men were unprepared. What did this mean for the Alamo? It meant that they weren't really prepared for what came to meet them. Even the siege of Bexar and the storming of Bexar in 1835 was a very close-run thing. Those men, after Stephen F. Austin went back to the United States on a diplomatic mission, and Houston was talking to the Cherokees to keep them out of the revolution, the men who actually ran the siege and storming of Bayeux, found Burleson and the others, Milam, who was killed, found out after the battle that the Mexicans surrendered because they were out of supplies and ammunition, and the Texans were this close to running out of supplies and ammunition. The lack of ready supplies was one of the reasons that the Alamo was so poorly ready for this war. The other thing that's going on is this deep division between those who wanted an offensive and a defensive war. If you wanted an offensive war, what happened to the Alamo? Most of the men and most of the supplies were taken out, down the San Antonio River, to Goliad, to Refugio, to San Patricio, to the men who wanted to attack Matamoros. The great myth of the middle of the Texas Revolution was that we can take Matamoros. Houston said, be careful. That's 150 miles across not very friendly territory, and it's not going to be friendly when you get there. But the men who wanted an offensive war weakened the Alamo. The men who wanted a defensive war, like Sam Houston, also wanted to weaken, if not completely abandon, the Alamo. So the two major sides, those who wanted an offensive war and those who wanted a defensive war, both left the Alamo high and dry. And that's one of the reasons they were in such trouble by the time that February and March of 1836 came along. Let me say a few more things about the divisions that were going on within Texas. Of course, within the larger Mexican nation, there is this battle that Melissa alluded to between the Centralists and the Federalists. And that's there, and that's going on, and there are wars being fought between 1829 and 1835 between Centralists and Federalists that Austin constantly tried to keep the Texans from getting engaged in. If they ever used those wars, it was to cover up what they had done when Travis first attacked Anahuac in 1832, and where Mexican soldiers were killed. They said after the fact, in the Turtle Bayou resolutions, oh, we were helping Santa Anna's revolution. It was a lie. They had no idea that they were helping Santa Anna's revolution when they began, but that's how they kept things quiet from 1832 to 1835. There's also the division that emerged even in New Orleans when the man I've been studying, Herman Ehrenberg, a member of the New Orleans Greys, came to Texas from New Orleans in two companies. There were deep divisions between native Mexicans who wanted a liberalized Federalist Mexico, and a lot of those people in New Orleans who wanted an independent Texas because they had investments in land, in cotton, in the mercantile business. They thought Texas was going to be their El Dorado in terms of the fortunes that they could make from an independent Texas. And at the very beginning of the Texas Revolution, there's this division between liberal Mexican Federalists who don't trust the Texans because they think they might be wanting to be independent, and those who, for both political and ethnic reasons, don't trust the Mexicans. Because there are some of these guys. Racism is there. Ethnocentrism is there. You can see it in Governor Smith, who says, I don't want any Mexicans voting when we elect a consultation or elect a convention to see if we're going to be independent. He was overruled by the larger council, but there were those men, especially on the Anglo side, who simply did not trust Mexicans of San Antonio or Nacogdoches, much less the Mexicans of Monterrey or Mexico City. I've mentioned before the differences between an offensive and a defensive war. This is what left Texas almost paralyzed early in 1836, as they really had no idea which direction they were going to go, and which led men like Johnson and Grant, who wanted to attack Matamoros, to lead their men to their almost certain deaths, as they tried to just come up against the professional army led up through coastal Texas by General Jose Cosme Urrea. And there was this political division within Texas, once they had the consultation and the convention between November of 1835 and March of 1836, when they had to decide which way to go. Do we defend the liberal Federalist Mexican Constitution of 1824, or do we push for independence? When Stephen F. Austin left Texas to go to New Orleans and the United States to raise money, when his ship left, he thought that the 1824 Constitution was going to be the way to go, that this was the only way they were going to get enough help from the Mexicans of the interior. When he got to New Orleans, he changed his mind in 24 hours when he saw the men and the material and the money and the support that the United States was going to give. See, this revolution could not have been won. It would have been game over without help, direct help from the United States, by individuals and by Andrew Jackson and his government keeping hands off. So the Texas Revolution is a mess. There's heroism, absolutely. Men who are in a mess are heroic. Look at the Battle of the Bulge. Look at those isolated soldiers surrounded by the German army in Belgium in 1944. You don't see heroism like that in everyday wars. But a mess had been created, and they showed their mettle. And so the Alamo is being fought in the middle of a total mess. Where was the center of Anglo settlement in Texas? Between the Colorado and the Brazos, and then the Trinity. And what does Houston have to do? Retreat from Gonzales after he hears about the Alamo to try to fight at the Colorado to keep the Mexican army from crossing? He says Fannin will be up shortly. Fannin delayed too long and got himself surrounded and got himself and almost all of his men killed. So he goes to the Brazos, and they have to burn the Texan capital of San Felipe, the Anglo-Texan capital of San Felipe. And then he has to cross the Brazos. And all this time, the settlers from Gonzales, from Matagorda, from San Felipe, from almost every Anglo settlement are streaming to the east to try to get across the Sabine if they can, maybe to get to Galveston Island where the Mexican army can't reach them. And in a kind of miracle, Sam Houston realizes that Santa Anna might get a little greedy and a little careless and make a mistake and try to capture the Texan civilian army, civilian government. He just barely misses them by less than minutes, and he finds himself separated from the rest of his army. And by the time Houston crosses the Brazos River on the Yellowstone steamship and comes down to what's now Houston, appropriately enough, and then finds out where Santa Anna is, they spend all day taking the floorboards out of a farmhouse and making a raft. What do they do with that raft? They cross Buffalo Bayou, and they get to the Lynchburg Ferry before Santa Anna, and then they fight the Battle of San Jacinto. And all this time, leading up to the Battle of San Jacinto, what is Houston saying? In his letters and in his speeches, and it really comes out at San Jacinto. What is he saying? These were the Spartan heroes in San Antonio. Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad. There's not going to be any mercy for you if you lose this battle. Go for it. It's do or die. And then after the victory at San Jacinto, as the great Haitian anthropologist and historian Michel Rolfe-Trouillot argues, when Santa Anna lost the Battle of San Jacinto, he also lost the Battle of the Alamo. Because had that other battle gone differently, what story would have been told about the Alamo? It was a completely different story. Now these are the men who bought time. These are the men who laid down their lives in what turned out to be a winning war. But Santa Anna would have written the history if San Jacinto had gone the other way. That's the background to what you're having to see and talk about when you talk about the Alamo. Thank you very much.
Have to change glasses. Yes, I can see. Thank you for having me here tonight. It's very nice to be here. One of the problems about the Alamo is that it's so well remembered, but it's how is it remembered? And it's often remembered kind of like it's the Super Bowl of the Texas Revolution, that it's the culmination when it really isn't. But we tend to, like a game, we focus on it and we go, well, what are the two sides that are playing? Well, it's the Mexicans or the Mexican government and the Texans. And I think you all would agree that's sort of a superficial way to look at it. And what I would say our task is, and what our task has been here at the Alamo for many years, is how do you get beyond that? How do you get beyond the superficial? Yes, Davy Crockett was here and he was wearing a coonskin cap. Please buy one in the gift shop before you leave. Dr. Crisp said it's a mess, but it's a fascinating mess, the Texas Revolution. And it is knowable. So it isn't like, oh, it's so confusing, I'll never understand this. You can understand it. And it's in the understanding of the Texas Revolution that you begin to get the understanding of the Battle of the Alamo and the significance of the Alamo. What we often tell people here, visitors, or what I would tell visitors, is the Texas Revolution is an event that occurs within an ongoing Mexican Civil War. And you can imagine most of them will go, I don't know what you're talking about. And you may be going, I don't know what you're talking about. But you understand Civil War. And like Dr. Chris said, if you look at Mexican history and you go, it's confusing, it's one revolution after another. But the context for that is the struggle between what's the government going to be? Is it going to be a federal republic or is it going to be centralized? And by the time of the Alamo, Santa Ana represents centralism and Texas represents the states or the departments that want to be federal. You know, they want power. So yeah, that's the big context for it. Now I gave you a map. You all have a map on your table. This could be the most important map you've ever seen regarding the Texas Revolution, if it changes your perspective on what's happening. Again, Dr. Chris talked about the colonies, but I want you to look at Behar, Goliad, and Copano. That comprises the frontier line. That comprises the frontier line for the Spanish, and it's the frontier line that is inherited by the Republic of Mexico. Now you can go, well, what about Louisiana? That's the far frontier. But the one that's sustainable and the one that becomes the gateway to the east is the one that's controlled by roads that go from the Rio Grande to Behar and from the Rio Grande to Goliad. So Behar and Goliad are the gateways. If you're going east or if you're going west, you're going through them. Think of San Antonio as, and this will sound sort of crass, but think of San Antonio as Buc-ee's. That you're traveling through a lot of territory and then you get to something important. And something important is San Antonio. And it's important because it's a population center. It's the government's here, seat of government, military garrison, commerce, and you can say the exact same thing about Goliad. So if you're wondering about the Texas Revolution, and it's why do we keep hearing about San Antonio? Why are they in San Antonio? What's the big deal about Goliad? They're important places because they control access through what we would now say is the frontier. And one of the misconceptions is that Santa Anna brings the army straight to San Antonio, and what is often left out, unless you're a student of the Revolution, is General Urrea. And Matamoros, the reason Matamoros is important is General Urrea goes from Saltillo region over to Matamoros and then northward because Tamaulipas is on the verge of, are we centralist, are we federalist? And so Santa Anna sends Urrea over there to go, you're centralist. We're here to make sure of that. Then he turns northward, and what did we say about Goliad? He's going to seize that gateway. So that's the whole logic for this part of the Texas Revolution, is seizing San Antonio, seizing Goliad, and also seizing the coast because that's where goods can be landed. So if you turn your paper over, mine's on a separate one, I got some quotes about the importance of Behar. And first one is from James C. Neal, who's the commander of the post at Behar, which includes the Alamo, and he's writing General Sam Houston. And he says, at Laredo, now 3,000 men under the command of General Ramirez and 2 other generals, and it appears from a letter received last night, 1,000 of them are destined for this place, Behar, and 2,000 for Matamoros. So again, go back to that map, and that's what that's talking about, coming up from the Rio Grande towards those 2 places. Now, the second one is February 2nd, James Bowie to Governor Henry Smith. And what he's saying is Bowie has been sent by Houston to Behar to sort of check out the situation. And what he says is the salvation of Texas depends in great measure in keeping Behar out of the hands of the enemy. It serves as a picket guard, and if it were in the possession of Santa Anna, there is no stronghold from which to repel him in his march towards the Sabine. So again, we've got to protect that place. But I think what's even more important, or as important, is down below, is he says, the citizens of Behar. So the people of the community of San Antonio deserve our protection, and the public safety demands our lives rather than to evacuate this post to the enemy. So again, Bowie saying, it's an important place. I know, General Houston, you're not in favor of this, but we on the ground, we know better in this case. We're better judges of what's happening. And then Travis comes to San Antonio. He's sent by Governor Smith, arrives very reluctantly. But once he gets there, he says, this being the frontier post nearest the Rio Grande, will be the first to be attacked. So again, look at the map, the idea coming, you've driven from Laredo to San Antonio. What are you going to find on the way? So again, that's why San Antonio is important, because there's something here. And he also says, we consider death preferable to disgrace, a very 19th century, early 19th century sentiment, which would be the result of giving up a post which had been so dearly won, referring to the Battle of Behar, and thus opening the door for the invaders to enter the sacred territory of the colonies. Again, so you look at the map, San Antonio, Goliad, and behind them to the east, the colonies. And then Travis writes again and says, it, being San Antonio, is the key to Texas from the interior. Without a footing here, the enemy can do nothing against the colonies. So you get the idea that they're thinking, this isn't just an unimportant place that we're occupying, but there's a reason that we're here. And the idea, we think it's important, and we think you should think it's important as well, which goes to later during the battle when Travis is sending out those letters. We told you it was important, we're here, now we're waiting for you to come. And then finally, Santa Anna says, Behar was held by the enemy and it was necessary to open the door to our future operations by taking it. So San Antonio is an important place. And if you've never considered it an important place, you need to do that. It's one reason that I think we should look at, when we look at the fighting around San Antonio, is we look at it in the context of the Texas Revolution, sort of a big overview, but it's a community event. So this is San Antonio history that involves San Antonio families and the community. Now, perspectives. I took a very literal approach to perspectives, motivation, and choices, and wrote some things down. And perspective, it's what perspective do you mean? And there's an Anglo perspective, there's a Tejano perspective, there's a Mexican perspective. Oddly enough, in the Texas Revolution, there's an American Indian perspective. And then you can do the political, Federalist versus Centralist. And then also, what about the people that are going, this isn't my fight? And that they choose to sit it out, whether they're Anglos or they're Tejanos, because there are people that do that. Now, the key is allow for variation within those groups. Don't assume that all Anglos think the same thing, because why else would you have the war party talking about colonists who are wanting to find a peaceful solution, and again, in the idea of reenacting the American Revolution, calling those who want a peaceful solution, calling them the Tory party. When you come to Tejanos, you've got those that are going, yes, we need to support the idea of the Constitution of 1824. And you've got others going, well, we're still part of Mexico. We need to act like it. On the Mexican idea, you got Santa Anna. How many of you are familiar with his vice president, Gómez Farías, Valentin Gómez Farías? Two different ideas. One is wanting to punish the church and take money and reduce the size of the army. Santa Anna's against that. And what about a Mexican like Stephen F. Austin? And you may go, well, he's not a Mexican. And it's, to you, is the term an ethnicity or is it a nationality? So how we see these things, what about James Bowie? He's a Mexican citizen. So how we kind of see these labels colors how we interpret the facts. Again, you could do the same thing with Native Americans, with the non-participants, but the idea is it isn't just, although again we divide them into teams, we tend to divide them into teams, there's variation there, and there's a lot of variation. And another perspective is we look at this with our perspective, where we bring our experience, we bring our knowledge, we bring our biases. And I would think that sometimes I've caught myself doing this, when I interpret something and I have to go, am I interpreting that through my eyes, or am I interpreting that through their eyes? And so, our perspective is important. What do we want? What do we want to see? Do we want to see a unified story? Do we want to see a story that, everybody has their own kind of pick and choose, like a smorgasbord? So our perspective is important. Motivation, if you look at the Mexican nationalist idea, the war is to preserve national territory. Texas is going to break away. They don't want Texas to break away. They want Texas to remain part of the Republic of Mexico. Preserve Mexican society. That, in a sense, they see these foreigners who have been coming in, and they're bringing foreign ideas. And so that needs to be, like Barney from, what was the show? Mayberry? Andy Griffith. That's got to be nipped in the bud. Got to nip that in the bud. And so the idea is we've got to push these foreigners back. We've got to put these foreigners in their place. And where we talk about race, religion plays a much bigger role than race, probably, because Protestant Americans who essentially do have a state religion, but Mexico, which has the religion of Catholicism, as a state religion. And so when you look at what Mexicans are saying about the foreigners, they're heretics, they're barbarians. How can you deal with these people? And when you look at Anglos that are looking at Mexicans, they're priest-ridden. They can't be Republicans, small r Republicans, because they owe their allegiance to the Pope. They can't have self-government because their religion won't allow them. And then also from the Mexican nationalist perspective is we've got to punish these ungrateful colonists and those who have come in illegally. Essentially, we've got to make this so that no more people want to come to Texas, at least from the United States. So that's the motivation from the sort of the official Mexican policy. And from the revolutionist, and that's a term that you often also see used at that time, it's, are they rebels? Are they insurgents? What are they? Well, I'll call them what they were calling themselves at times, revolutionist. And the idea of, again, extending that 1776 idea is they're wanting to defend and to extend the system of small r Republican government. So we're going to make Texas a true republic. Mexico tried, but they couldn't do it, and we're going to do it this time. Land. Revolution is about controlling land and the resources, and no doubt about that. Personal advancement, that in the 19th century, if you wanted to enter politics, you better have a good war record. You could, so that you had a campaign slogan like Tippy Canoe and Tyler too, and they can go, oh, he killed Tecumseh. So the idea that you're a war hero, locally, that gets you elected to office. Look at David Crockett. State gets you elected to state office, gets you elected into national office. So personal advancement. And then just the idea, you look at the age of people that are taking part in this revolution, adventure. That, in a sense, hey, let's go to, like Kevin Young used to talk about. Some of you remember Kevin Young talking about it's like spring break. These young men are going to Texas for spring break, and what they're going to do is they're going to do something noble and laudable. They're going to free Texas from a military despotism, and they're going to have a good time doing it. So, choices. Choices on both sides are pretty much, are you going to fight? Another choice is to give up or to abandon. Are the colonists going to say, we're not going to stay here and fight for what we think is ours and leave? Or is the Mexican government going to say, Texas, who needs it? And let it go? No, they're not going to do that. Or the third option we've already talked about is, are you going to go, if you're a Tejano resident, you're going to go, I don't know. I'm going to go to my ranch or to my relative's ranch, and I'm going to sit this out and see how it comes out. Or if you're a colonist and you say, my neighbors are going off to fight, but I've got to stay here and take care of my family. And I'll take care of their family too. So it's noble that I stay behind. And so there's a lot of non-participation. Now, Daniel Cloud, there's a little quote from him. He's from Kentucky. Actually, he was about an hour and a half away from where I grew up in Kentucky. He was from Russellville. And Russellville is on the border down between Kentucky and Tennessee. It's also sort of famous because Jesse James held their bank up. And you go there and they point at, those are bullet holes, which probably aren't from Jesse James, but they point to it anyway. But he's there, and he writes a letter to his family, and he says, the cause of philanthropy, of humanity, of liberty, and human happiness throughout the world calls loudly on every man who can to aid Texas. If we succeed, the country is ours. It is immense in extent and fertile in its soil, and it will amply reward our toils. If we fail, death in the cause of liberty and humanity is not a cause for shuddering. So when we look at motivation, we can look at this and go, very laudable motives. He's fighting for liberty. But he also says, hey, and we get land. So if you're looking for, they're fighting for the land, and that's all it is. People do things for different motivations. And sometimes we just need to realize that. But I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you tonight. And hopefully I gave you some food for thought. And you will think about Texas geography differently. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crisp, Dr. Winders. That was excellent. So now we're going to go ahead and go into our panel, if that's all right, because we're doing pretty well on time. So we thought we'd go right in and then take a break in a little bit. So I'd like to also introduce some other members of our panel up here. For our panel discussion, we're also joined by Dr. Gilberto Hinojosa and Ernesto Rodriguez. Dr. Hinojosa has written academic works on Spanish and Mexican Laredo, the missionary-led Indian towns, and on immigrant communities, and has published articles in Culture and San Antonio Express News. He's a professor emeritus of the University of the Incarnate Word Department of History, and Ernesto Rodriguez is a San Antonio native and has worked at the Alamo for over 20 years and now serves as curator here at the Alamo. So to kick us off, gentlemen, the first question curated by our advisory committee theme captains tonight is, when you think about what was happening in San Antonio de Bejar in the months leading up to the Battle of 1836, right? We just got a wonderful master class on the larger political forces going on. What was happening here as all of these things were swirling? Who's got first at bat?
You want to take that?
I'll let you start.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm always surprised that I get invited to these planning conferences on the Alamo, since I come from a generation of olvídate del Alamo, forget the Alamo, because of how the Alamo story was used as an anti-Mexican hammer and as a racist. I think one of the things that happens with historians eminent historians as well, including those at this table, is that they're political historians, and they're political historians because politicians leave all kinds of records, or they're military historians because military people leave all kinds of records. And what people don't see is the ordinary people and the reasons why they come together, form a community, the reasons why they're here. And so from an economic perspective, you would see what's happening not just in San Antonio, the Bejar, but what's happening across the state of Coahuila, Texas. And we could talk, there's books and books and books about centralists versus, liberals in Mexican politics. And there's also books and books that will detail every military move and so on. Well, what were the people doing here? Well, people were making a living. Surprise. They weren't talking politics, they were making a living. And they were making a living, and so the issue is, what were they making a living, from? Well, the Tejanos had, in the long stretch, been making a living from horses and cattle and mules and selling them to Saltillo or to New Orleans. This was the economic base of San Antonio. It began to change towards Louisiana with the American Revolution, and it opened up a new market for the ranchers that had these herds of horses and mules, and also began after the American Revolution. They began to sell to American settlers mules. So these folks were connected with the growth of the American economy. And the Tejanos involved in the revolution, in the Texas Revolution, including some of the lights of San Antonio, Ruiz, and others, were into either merchants or they were the land agents involved in this huge enterprise of land speculation and land, the buying of land in East Texas by the wave of Anglo-Americans connected with the U.S. economy. So if I were to set a panel for this museum, and I would dedicate a good bit of the panel to the economics of what's going on, and maybe even have a little footnote about the liberals and conservatives. No, I'm just kidding. These historians are not going to like me after this. But those are very important issues, obviously. These men were leaders, and as they get involved in these political issues, they round up supporters and motivate people. But I'd like to see what people were doing for a living and how this changed the dynamics of Bejar significantly, the connection with the U.S. economy. This little book edited by De La Teja with the Tejanos involved in the Tejano leaders involved with the Texas Revolution, almost all of them, maybe one or another, was not involved in the growing American economy. So there should be a panel that discusses the American economy and the population growth in the United States and what Americans were doing for a living. Most Americans were doing for a living, they were growing subsistence crops. Yes, they were growing their own corn and their own wheat, but they were growing cash crops that they were connected with the World Trade Network. And so from the very beginning, this was an economy of conquest of lands by the English, of Indian lands, in order to have Englishmen and other Europeans come in and grow cash crops and link them to the English and the World Trade Network that they facilitated for the American colonists. And so this is the economic history, the nitty-gritty, and people would come and start a farm, and it would take them about 7 months to set up their log cabin and to start their subsistence crop, and then they would go into a cash crop. And this cash crop they would sell in a World Trade Network. In the South, this cash crop was cotton. And all these people involved in the East Texas, they were facilitating people growing cotton. It's not bad. I'm not putting them down for growing cotton. I'm saying this is what they were doing. And they were growing a cash crop that was cotton, and this cotton was, made profitable with enslaved African Americans. And every single one of these folks were either buying land and bringing a slave or into slave trading themselves, including, this is what people in the southern frontier did. And slaves became increasingly more profitable. The price of a slave was already of an enslaved African American was already rising at the turn of the century. It would become even more so in the 40s and 50s after the Depression of 37. As they got through the Depression of 37, terrible time during the Republic, then the economy picked up again in the late 40s and 50s, and the price of an enslaved person, was moved very, very high. In today's dollars, that would be $13,000 and so on. Prior to the Texas Revolution, the price of an enslaved person was not that high, but the price was rising, and people who had money invested in this, and of course, so you have basically Stephen F. Austin, directing. Basically, he's a land speculator, and he's bringing in. It's the same kind of war that brought on the French and Indian War when the folks created the Ohio Company and moved into what was then French-controlled subsistence crop and building your cabin, and then you started growing a cash crop that you got into the market. So they take the land away from the Indians. Then they take away the land from the French. Then they take away the land from the English as this population is growing and this economy is growing. And then they take the land away from the Spaniards in Florida. And then Mexico is next. Surprise. And so we have to put this in the context of the growth of an economic nation that's accompanied with a very high population growth. Both of natural increase as well as immigration, and so on. And this conflict that is the Texas Revolution then gets an economic conflict when Mexico stations troops where? In East Texas, at the harbors, interrupting trade, that economic livelihood. And these economic issues then get translated into political terms, in the liberals versus conservatives, in political ideals of liberty. Liberty for what? Liberty to have our land, grow our cotton with our slaves. So let's be honest about this whole thing, and we'd say the same thing about what we do today. We're concerned about making a living. And this is what they were doing. And the political historians have all these records of the political conflicts, and they have ample stuff to write about. The military historians have all these records, and they like the moving of troops. But I'd like to see the background. Now, it doesn't have to be the center of the exhibit, obviously, but it cannot go unmentioned. There's the economic, and show the different kinds of the economics involved in what's going on in Mexico as well. The commerce controlled by the merchants in Mexico City, the folks in the north competing with the merchants in Mexico City that dominate the sale of manufactured goods, and so on. The silver centers that are away from the center, and so on, compete for power from the center, and you have a the liberal versus conservative struggle in Mexico is basically the economic interest of Mexico City and Puebla versus the economic interest of the French. And so these are real factors, and that doesn't take away from the fact that when push came to shove, people took a stand. But it involves economics, folks. So, you know, I just want that aspect, that perspective to be included. It was a Mexican Civil War of sorts over economic interest as well, not just this political ideals of, you know, the conservatives are always looked as the oppressors, you know, and so on. And the liberals always have the high ideals and so on. This is conservative with a C in Mexican politics, and with a capital C, and liberals with a capital L. So this economic aspect, I think, needs to be covered in some way. If you gave me an opportunity to design something in the museum. The same thing happens with the post Alamo and post-revolution, the taking of the Rio Grande as the border in order to control the ports of Matamoros and Santa Fe. And the United States now has a bigger view where they want to control. They're no longer just farming cash crops. You have this market revolution in the United States. The United States is becoming a producer of manufactured goods, and it becomes a vital thing to control the port of Matamoros. And those involved in the Texas Revolution, we're already seeing that. This whole drive that you talked about earlier, about the drive towards Matamoros, was to control the port.
Absolutely.
Of the Brazo Santiago.
They
And,
thought the war was going to pay for itself if they
That's
could
right.
take Matamoros.
and have the imports into Mexico. And so, I mean, these factors are there. They need to be considered. And the fact that the Tejanos and Mexicans beyond the Nueces have lands, and that's an economic interest, and the American economy will move very quickly into Brownsville after the war, after the 48, and a little slower into Laredo and so on, very quickly into El Paso in some ways, because it controls that trade, Santa Fe trade, through mines in Querétaro and Zacatecas. So all these things, all these factors, I think, need to be included in some fashion.
Thank you, Doctor. So Ernesto, to you.
So if you look at what's happening in Mexico that affects Texas, March 31st, 1835, really important date, everybody should know it. It is the Militia Reduction Act. That Militia Reduction Act limits the number of militiamen to 1 man for every 500 inhabitants. San Antonio has a population of about 3,000, so you have 6 people in the militia that can protect you. Second part, all heavy armament will be sent to a central location. That's why the Alamo is full of cannon, because they're being shipped everywhere. That gun at Gonzales will be the flashpoint when the Mexican army is ordered to go get it. But that's a part of the problem that's happening. Mexico is changing. You have a gentleman that was elected as a federalist that leaves control to his vice president, who affects 3 major groups in Mexico: the landowners, the church, and the military. Who gets you elected? The landowners, the church, and the military. So when Farias goes against them, they ask for Santa Anna to come back. And Santa Anna has a few demands. In order to do so, he must enact a special clause in the Constitution of 1824, which allows the president to take extraordinary powers. He does that. It's been done before, and he does it himself. There's this concept that Santa Anna is a self-proclaimed dictator. That's impossible. You cannot be self-proclaimed dictator. If I were to walk out into the plaza and say, I am the dictator, people are going to say you're crazy.
You could identify
Yeah, I could, but. So Santa Ana then assumes more control, centralizes all authority, turns all the states into departments. Imagine living in Texas, out in the middle of nowhere, where you're joined to a state already, but you still self-govern yourself. And now you're really being watched. And like Dr. Hinojosa said, troops are being sent north. They're being sent north because they see the problems with people free thinking and not going along with the government ideas. But there's also something else happening. We all know the big three: Mejia, Zavala, Farias. Those are a big three. They have met in Louisiana, and the plan is that they will have a three-prong assault in Mexico. One will be Zavala coming into Texas. The other one will be Farias going into central Mexico. And then the military might of General Mejia is supposed to be the strong arm. He fails. Farias does not. Zavala does not. You look at what Farias does, he travels through central Mexico. Anywhere there's a revolt, guess who's been there? This man named Valentin Gomez Farias. So he's starting revolts in central Mexico. Zavala comes into Texas, same idea. He is actually so important to the story that there's a gentleman that writes in a journal, "I have met the most interesting man in Texas," and it's Zavala. Gentleman that came from humble beginnings, was imprisoned for his ideas. He helps write the Constitution of 1824. He learns French. He becomes a doctor. He speaks fluent English. He is one of the most influential individuals that's in the area. Guess who he's connected to? The prominent families of San Antonio. They all know who he is. In San Antonio, you have these prominent families that are having to make the decision of what to do. Do you start fighting for the cause and risk everything? Many of these people remembered what happened in 1813. They participated in 1813 in the Battle of Medina. They remember the onslaught. So in San Antonio, the people are talking about what's going to happen. They are the center of the universe in Texas. It's the biggest town. It's the most important town. It's a town that is so important that when they have the consultation in November, it doesn't succeed because who's not there? Bear. Who is at the convention of 36? Bear. And with the Tejano support from Bear, you now have the opportunity to lead a revolt because you have a large group of people that will side with you. Why do the people of San Antonio side with the revolution and many of the people at Goliad do not? These are connected. They are mixing with the Anglo settlers. They communicate often. The group that's at Goliad does not. Why? Those people that show up are not people from the area. Here, Santiago Bowie marries into a family. Dickinsons are staying at the Muski's house. So you have people that are connected. When we think about big three as well, since I have the platform, where does we talk about the big three. So who else is it? Urea, Santa Ana, Filisola, it's another big three. Or you have the big three that comes from Crockett, Travis, and Bowie. And we all think, well, who brought them, who puts them into this prominent spotlight? And you'll be amazed that it's a Tejano. Juan Seguin, when he comes to pick up the ashes, he has this long funerary speech. And one of the things he says, ahí tenéis a vuestros hermanos, Travis, Bowie, Crockett, y otros varios a quienes su valor los coloca en el número de mis héroes. He mentions the big three, Crockett, Travis, Bowie, and others that I will put in the halls of heroes. It's a native San Antonian putting up the big three. He could have said Lozoya, Esparza, Abamillo, but no, he picked three people that would resonate amongst the rest of the colony.
I guess we're moving this way. when I used Daniel Cloud's quote, and I pointed out the fact that part of it is very flowery and talks about ideals, political ideals, and then the other part talks about land and the idea that there can be mixed motives. So for a long time in historiography, it's been sort of divided into the political camp versus the economic camp. And what I would suggest is that there does need to be, both need to be represented. I don't know that you put them on a scale and you go, well, you got to have 50-50, but they both have to be represented, because what Dr. Hinojosa is talking about is people. And often what we do is we tell history about facts and dates, and we give the impression that there are people there, but we don't really breathe life into them as to what their life was like. Again, talking about motivation and things like that. One of the things that I've learned about San Antonio and this area, again, coming to the Alamo back in the mid-90s, came with the Texas Revolution, the Alamo, but again, it's, well, what's the setting? And that's why I say that this is a community event. So when you talk about the community, just like there's a brand new biography of Ruiz out. Who's Albert? Who's the?
Martinez Vara.
Say it.
Art Martinez Vara.
Okay. But very good. And what it does is you can read that book and you get a sense of San Antonio being an actual place with people. And I think that that's what any exhibit needs to do, is not necessarily, there's this idea of you got to have the wall with the defenders' names. That doesn't mean a lot to me, and it never has, unless you can tell me something about them. Make them real. There's an idea about we need to have the names of the Indian converts. Again, I'd say just that by itself doesn't do that much for me, other than checks off a list. But who were they? Can you develop their life? And you can look at the economics of the mission, but can you make them real? And I think that what makes people real is what they do for a living. How they are shaped by the economic environment around them, but it's also, what do they think? And so it's merging those two things that I think will give us and visitors a better understanding of this event.
And San Antonio's economy was changing, and it began changing in the 1770s when, the ranchers in San Antonio and Goliad and elsewhere in Texas, and also Coahuila, were beginning sending mules, horses and mules to, and so they were now, the link of San Antonio was now turning towards the American economy. And this is basically what the inspector did in 28 and then in 32. Teran, I think, in 28, right? He basically came and said, once you go past San Antonio, it doesn't look like Mexico anymore. And why doesn't it look like Mexico anymore? Well, it doesn't look like Mexico because everybody there is farming. What he really meant, it doesn't look like northern Mexico. Everybody there is farming, where everybody else in the span across, Texas and Coahuila and Chihuahua and so on, are doing or have ranches that are supplying the mules and so on for the mines. And so the economy is different. And of course, you have the population growth connected with this cash crop economy. This is just the rise, a spectacular rise of the population of the United States. And it's just, the numbers are daunting, from a few 100,000 in 1700 to over 2 million in 1776. And so you have this huge, demography, high natural growth rate, and then high immigration rates. And so you have this, booming population, and they were coming here and they were starting farms, growing self-subsistent crop and cash crops that were into this World Trade Network, which became easier to ship as the 30s went on with the building of roads and canals. San Antonio is also changing. And these men, they understandably,
Let me speak to that point by talking about directly what people in San Antonio are thinking in the middle of 1835, because that's when the manure starts to hit the fan, if you'll pardon the expression, is in the middle of 1835. The late, great David J. Weber at SMU once misinterpreted a letter. And I corrected him on it, and like most great scholars, he thanked me rather than getting angry for it. It's a letter between two Irishmen. As you probably know, if you go down to Refugio, if you go down to San Patricio, these were Irish as well as Mexican towns. And James Carr and Juan Lynn of Victoria are having a letter back and forth between them, and one of them is telling the other one what the people of San Antonio are thinking at the time. What are the people at Bay are thinking? And he says, using a pronoun, they believe that their feet are polluting the soil of Texas. So here are the people of San Antonio, and they're referring to someone, and they're saying their feet are polluting the soil of Texas. Now, Dr. Weber, because he, like most of us, grew up in Texas, had this sort of mindset that ethnic division was at the heart of the Texas Revolution. I had to learn myself out of that. That's the myth that was taught to me in North Texas in the 1950s, by my school, by the movies, by everything, by Texas history movies, the comic book. It was greasers and gringos. But Weber was wrong. Who do you think the Mexican citizens of San Antonio were talking about when they said their feet, this is mid-1835, their feet are polluting the soil of Texas just by stepping on it? Who are they talking about? Are there any guesses out there? It was the Mexican soldiers under General Cos who had just occupied San Antonio. That's who they were talking about. This was not referring to the Anglos who had come in and polluted the soil of Texas. They're talking about a military dictatorship. I know that word is not technically correct, but that's how people in Texas saw it. You're going to be limited. Yes.
If I could lead in there, that's a good pivot to one of our subsequent questions, which is, why did some families flee? Why did some families stay? Right? What do we know about kind of the analysis that individual households in the San Antonio region kind of did in deciding how to act in the face of these events?
Let me lead into that by what I was about to say, because I think it works. I've been looking at the Texas Revolution through the eyes of a German teenager. His name was Hermann Ehrenberg, and he came with the New Orleans Grays to San Antonio in November of 1835. And he went back to Germany after several years in the Texas Republic and wrote his memoir. It's the longest and most vivid memoir of any soldier in the Texas Army. What do you think the victorious Texans and the defeated Mexican soldiers were doing in the week or so before General Cos took them back to the Rio Grande? They were playing cards with each other. They were having friendly card games. And what Ehrenberg did for most of that time was visit families, watching them shell pecans, constantly walking through cornfields. Every time he mentions walking around the area around San Antonio, he's talking about a cornfield. So the people, like today, are eating a lot of corn and a lot of pecans and a lot of beef. And he's learning what Mexican food is all about. And he's going to fandangos. And he's seeing a community. He eventually goes on a tourist trip down to the San Jose Mission. He and a friend got on horseback. They packed some ribs for lunch. They go down to they pass the one mission and get all the way to San Juan. And they find hidden corn. It's going to be someone's winter. But the Texan Army needs corn. And so they work out an arrangement that the Texans buy about a half or a third of the corn and pay a good price for it. And so this is what is happening in San Antonio. In the months between the siege and storming of Bexar, the Battle of 1835, December 35, and the Battle of the Alamo that comes in February and March of 1836. And there's already a feeling among many in San Antonio that their biggest danger, the biggest danger to them, is the Mexican army. Because that's what they were thinking even when Coss came in 1835, if you can believe the letter.
Well, that's quite possible because their interest was already changing to the American economy in East Texas, with all the Tejanos being land brokers.
And they've spent much of their lives being either ignored or dictated to from Mexico City.
Well, the Mexico City, I mean, that's always, everybody says that all the time, but that's irrelevant in my view, because Mexico City didn't have anything to do with Texas other than the fact that under Spain and under Mexico, they didn't provide the adequate defense against the Apaches and Comanches. But that's the only role. And the problem was not whether Mexico City was attending to them or not. The problem was what is their economy connected to? And so the economy was not connected with Mexico City. The economy at best was connected with the fair at Saltillo and with the exportation of horses and mules to New Orleans and to the American settlers who were growing, surprise, subsistence food plus cash crops. In their case, cotton on the system. And Coss and the others who moved eventually to East Texas was to interfere with that because Terán, and I forget at the moment who did the inspection of 32. Almonte. They both said, the population in East Texas is growing. They're doing a different kind of economy. They're linked. I have mine right here. Thank you. They're linked to the U.S. economy. Texas is drifting into the American orbit.
Yes.
Basically, that's what they said. Mm-hmm. It's drifting into the American economic orbit.
I think, I get your point.
I overmake it to be sure, but it's correct.
But it's all about perspective. The idea of even when you have people coming from the heart of Mexico up through San Antonio, they'll say, these people are different.
And in Nacogdoches, they're really different.
They're really different. These are different animals.
Yeah.
And again, it's because of the connection with the United States, whether it's ideological or it's economic. They've in a sense, they've been, I don't want to use the word polluted, but they have been in contact and they cannot be changed back to where they were.
They're borderlands people.
Yeah.
And when Sanchez and the Mexican officers that he was with get to Nacogdoches, they say these people don't even speak Spanish well at all.
Yeah, people from Mexico City always accuse the.
But you know what?
those people.
But when Herman Ehrenberg visited Nacogdoches
Yeah.
and was taken into a Mexican coffee house, you know what he said? He said, these people don't speak English well at all.
Yeah, right.
And that's the trouble in a borderland. The people on either side.
Now,
You see it here.
if I can move us forward, then I want to take us to the battle and the time of the battle proper. What do you think were
I
the?
have something important.
All right.
I'll keep it very short.
Last bite at the apple, then we move.
Gutierrez-McGee expedition, 1813. San Antonio had been under military rule before with General Arredondo. Families had been forced into exile, mass executions, and so
By the Spaniards.
by the Spanish. And so they have gone through the Battle of Bejar. Whew, we made it. And now Santa Anna's coming. So some of them, those that can, are going, we're leaving. And those that can't, the Esparza family that's here at the Alamo, the reason they can't leave is they can't get a cart. So they have to come into the Alamo because they can't get a cart. Juana Alsbury's husband, Navarro, he's off getting a cart when that's why he's not at the Alamo. So people have been leaving for weeks, and we fear another Arredondo type event.
And Santa Anna was with Arredondo.
Yep.
So when we think about, Santa Anna's choice to attack San Antonio de Bejar instead of elsewhere in Texas first, what do you see as the consequence of that choice? And are there any choices that could have changed the outcome?
That's your question.
Yes, no. Well, he has to come here.
He had to come to Buc-ee's.
All roads lead to San Antonio, basically. The Caminos Reales came through here, everything was here. The Battle of the Alamo is a battle for the town, not the site we're at. This happens to be the thing that's in the way. If you know, when the Mexican army marches in, one of the first things that's written in Almonte's journal is, we took Bear without firing a shot. They took the town, but now they have to deal with the little problem that's across the river, which is the Alamo. Could he have gone around? Yes, but your supply lines have to come through San Antonio. So do you want to risk that? No. There's a reason that Urea goes up that other main road, because they go like this, right? They come straight up. And so he could have done it, but it would not make sense, because now you're putting your supply lines at risk. Why does he choose, if you read his many manifestos, they all talk about why he's preparing, how he's preparing, and he's sending troops north. He happens to he stops the troops from moving north because of an important reason. He gets sick, so for 2 weeks he's sick, he's bedridden, so he doesn't allow the troop movements to continue. The plan was to be here early December. It's pushed back. They arrive in February. But the strategic location of the fact that this place sits on the main road, it's a place that can supply your troops. It's a place you can bring the commissaries up. And is one of the things that he also says, he tells one of his officers, make sure you have the commissary move up. Who's in charge of the commissary? A guy named Dromundo. Who's Dromundo? His brother-in-law. Not Gos. Dromundo is the brother-in-law. Dromundo controls everything that matters to the army, to supply it. Who carries the money? Who do you put in that position? Well, you put family, because that way you can always control it. They go, well, Gos was his brother-in-law. Okay, why would you send your brother-in-law to the middle of nowhere? Unless you didn't like him. But in this case, San Antonio is a strategic location. It's important. And so he could have tried to avoid it, but it doesn't make sense. You need to be able to fill your supply lines. You need to be able to have a place that's established. What happens after the Battle of the Alamo? There's a lot of wounded. What happens at Goliad? There's a lot of wounded. And so where are the wounded? They're sent back to the Alamo. One of the things that one of his officers is always complaining about, we don't have supplies to deal with the sick. So he's constantly sending letters into the interior of the Republic going, I need medicine, I need medicine, I need medicine. But it can be shipped here. This is a major location, so there's ways to travel up and down. And so there's no reason to not take the site, because strategically it provides a base for operations.
And another thing he says is that we can't leave it because it would become a rallying point for the rebels. So we can't have a rallying point back behind their lines.
One of the great weaknesses of the Mexican government in the Texas Revolution was their Navy. Their Navy was totally outfought and outfoxed by the Texans, who were aided by the Americans. And because Santa Anna could take Copano, Urrea took Copano. That was the main port for San Antonio, as well as for Goliad. But if the ships can't make it there, then you're not going to be able to resupply yourself. And so one of the reasons that after the little battle of San Jacinto, where most of the Mexican army had survived elsewhere, one of the reasons they have to go back, first of all the way to the Colorado and then further, is because they can't be resupplied. Filasola had no choice but to retreat.
And the reason for that superior American Navy, I'll tell you, Americans from the colonial period had been into shipbuilding.
Shipbuilding, yep.
And it was in fact shipbuilding that made the economy of the English colonies in North America along the Atlantic seacoast not act like a true, colonial area, in the sense that in the mercantilist system, you're supposed to take raw materials out and bring in manufactured goods, the traditional mercantilist system. Well, the English found it less costly to build the ships in New England than to have the lumber, shipped to England to build those ships. And because they were into a world trade network, they were building a large number of ships. And they had the forest to do that because they had taken the land away from the Indians, of course.
And if you take a look at the people
how many trees do you think it took to build an English ship? 2,100. 2,100 trees to build a warship.
What I started to say is, if you take a look at some of the captains in the Mexican Navy, they have names like Thompson.
They were
Because
English.
they're English or Americans
Right.
who have signed up for the Mexican Navy.
And the U.S. is involved in this commerce, this World Trade Network, and they want to take it over, which is part of the revolution.
So I'm going to bring us back to the battle, because we're nearing the end of our time.
How many, let me ask
And
Dr.
the
Chris.
question that I'm going to ask, is, are there any choices that might have changed the outcome of the battle? We didn't really hear a thought on that, and I think that one's one of great interest to folks. How might it have been otherwise?
Not reinforcements. If Sam Houston had tried to reinforce or relieve the Alamo with the men he had at Gonzales, it would have been a suicide mission. When Fannin tried to reinforce the Alamo from Goliad, you know how far he got? 200 yards before they gave it up. All they did was cross the river. That was about it. It wasn't going to be reinforced. My friend Rick Range, who a name that some of you may know, he's very much deeply into the battles of the Alamo today. But he and a friend of his wrote a piece several years ago about how the Battle of the Alamo could have been won by the defenders who were here. And it is essentially taking a chapter out of The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter and building outer and inner and even further inner defenses so that you could slaughter the Mexican army as they came in. I reviewed the piece. I thought it was a little bit fantastical, maybe a lot fantastical.
So only if they'd had that instead of Sir Walter Scott.
I guess so, yeah, but it was a very elaborate way of building the defenses so that you knew you were going to be outnumbered and how you could possibly survive. A lot like the battles of the Lord of the Rings. You know, I think Rick's thesis was strained.
Had
put it that way.
Houston already recruited the volunteers from the U.S. by that time?
Well, there were some coming in. The New Orleans Greys were there.
Yeah.
But most of the New Orleans Greys had been taken away to go to Matamoros on that
Yeah.
will-o'-the-wisp fantastical expedition.
One of the things about Houston is that if you go to the IMAX film, one of the last credits you'll see is, they did not die in vain. They bought Sam Houston time to build his army. You know, you talk about myths of the Alamo, that may be the granddaddy of all myths, because Houston has no army. He's trying to build an army. He's been given command of the regular army, but it's yet to be raised. And so he's gone off to Nacogdoches in that area to keep the Cherokees neutral, so they don't come in on the side of the Mexican government. He doesn't show back up until like February 23rd or February 29th at Washington on the Brazos. People are going, where's Sam Houston? He's dealing with the Cherokees. But oddly enough, it will be the 350 men who have been raised by Travis's letters that when Sam Houston does show up at Gonzales, that becomes the nucleus for his army.
That's right.
But this is something that's very important that I've not seen before, but it struck me as I was doing some research and writing, is that March 1st becomes the magic date. And Houston has given orders for all of his officers to raise their companies and to be ready on the frontier for active campaigning on March 1st. What else is supposed to happen on March 1st? Convention.
Yep.
So March 1st becomes that date. We're waiting for something to happen. But Santa Anna moves the schedule up, and he arrives before they expect him. So it changes everything. And could there have been a different outcome to the Alamo? What I would say is, would we remember the Alamo had it been a victory? Would we even be here talking about the Alamo? And I would say chances are much less likely.
So the last question, when you think about how the Alamo narrative, right, how the battle fit into the overall narrative of U.S. westward expansion, you know, what do you think its consequence was, right, to the broader manifest destiny playing out in the U.S.?
Well, the obvious thing is the the way in which this war between Americans versus Mexicans then was used as an anti-Mexican campaign. It was not for a light reason that we feared going into 7th grade because they were going to tell us that all the Mexicans are evil and so on. And it's part of the campaign in order to recruit volunteers. At some point when they sent Austin to recruit volunteers, they didn't go come fight the conservatives in Mexico. They went and said, come fight, the oppressors, the bad Mexicans, and so on. So we feared going into 7th grade, and we knew better. I happen to have known better because both my parents, despite being immigrants, were literate in English and Spanish, and they had read their history, and they remembered their Mexican history. And, and so it was used as an anti-Mexican slogan, and then historians then began saying, well, it was a clash of cultures, moving one step away from, race.
Yeah.
And then it became liberals versus conservatives, which is well represented on this panel. You saw the dig there, right? Instead of it looking at it, from my perspective, and that is that there's what people are doing for a living, in fact, affects what they do. One of the questions would be, of the defenders of the Alamo, how many came after 32?
Most.
Most of them, right? And so you could say these folks that came in to Mexican Texas after 1832 came when getting land and securing land was insecure, and keeping their grants were insecure. And so they entered an economically insecure environment. And so, but the anti-Mexican thing of the Alamo is quite clear. One of the ways in which we try to do it a little better was, well, there were Tejanos in the Alamo. And so, I'm not from San Antonio, from a San Antonio family. Both my parents are immigrants from Mexico. But there I was in 1988 with a bullhorn. Our friend doesn't mention that. Our friends in the new book doesn't mention the fact that I had a bullhorn, calling out the names of the Tejanos inside the Alamo. And the other rebels around me, shouting presente and so on, in order to change the narrative a little bit, that there were Tejanos inside the Alamo. It wasn't planned. Someone actually said, why don't you read the list? I may have had the list myself, but I remember the bullhorn. And then we marched up on the staircase in the IMAX theater, and that bullhorn just made the sound, make the walls shake. And we were saying we were there. And in the history is, you weren't there because you were dirty, lazy Mexicans. And there were all kinds of anti-Mexican. I had a student, or met a fellow rather, way back, sometime back, who was in World War II, and he was in the Mexican, many of the Mexican Americans and Mexicans who were drafted, and the sergeant's telling him, he's learning how to fire a rifle. He's never held a rifle. And he says, you damn Mexicans, you can't shoot straight, you're good for nothing Mexicans. The sergeant, well, of course, that's how sergeants speak, right? He says, that's how come you didn't win at the Alamo. That's how come we beat you at the Alamo. And the guy said, sir, he said he was tempted to say, sir, I think we won at the Alamo. But it was just, it's one of the many ways in which it was used as an anti-Mexican slogan. And so how do we deal with that? Well, as I said, there were Tejanos inside, and so on. And that alleviates somewhat the issue. And it's a problem. It's a problem. And putting it in the context of liberals and conservative Mexican political struggle, it helps, I would like to put it in the sense of, what people do for a living. And
Thank you, Doctor. Ernesto?
you cut me off, right? Before I went.
You have a lot to say, compadre.
When you think about westward expansion, one of the things that happens is in 41 with the
18 or 19?
41 with the Santa Fe expedition.
Right.
And who's a member of that group?
Jose Antonio Navarro.
So it's not just Anglo-centric.
No.
It's people from Texas wanting to expand their growth. So
Why Santa Fe? Because the American goods were traveling from St. Louis to Santa Fe and then down into Zacatecas and Querétaro, and silver was coming back up. And this is America. That's why they claim Santa Fe and Matamoros. The Rio Grande, the port of Matamoros is on this side of the Rio Grande.
What most people don't understand is that the critical year in turning Anglos and Mexicans against each other in Texas was not 1836, it was 1842. When San
It was
Antonio,
happening before that. I think it
well,
was happening before that.
Seguin is
Right.
Seguin is not just a senator in the Texas Congress, Juan Seguin. He's the chairman of the Committee on Military Affairs, and he doesn't speak English. This is a different kind of Texas Republic than most people think they know about. But when the two invasions from below the Rio Grande, which capture San Antonio in 1842, Seguin is fighting on the Texan side in the first one.
Yeah, right.
But they spread rumors. The Vasquez expedition spreads rumors that Seguin is in contact. Actually, Seguin had warned both the San Antonio City Council and the Texan Republic government that you better watch out, the Mexican army's on its way. And so they withdrew from town in time, they got their troops together, they chased the Mexican army back. But between the two invasions in the spring and the fall, Seguin was accused of treason, and those who were enemies of Seguin in San Antonio, who wanted to use his ethnicity against him, did so, and ran him out of Texas.
That is a very good point about the year changing things significantly because of the Mexican attempts to retake Texas. But Tejanos in Béjar were already losing their ranches before that.
What I would say is, if you look at the city council records and members of councilmen, up through the 40s and into the early 50s, you're still seeing
Right.
Tejanos. It's in the 1850s when you start to see them being pushed off the council. Who's coming in the 1850s? What are the names that you're starting to see?
Callahan?
You're starting to see German names. And so it would be easy to say, the Anglos are pushing the Tejanos off, but there's a
It's the American
like you
economy.
said,
It's the American economy.
San Antonio is changing in the 1840s and 1850s.
It was changing before that. As soon as the war is over, the buying of the ranches began. And so this is part of the westward movement of the American economy. It's got highly capitalized, it's got a stronger capital and the ties are very close to New Orleans and the U.S. trade with the World Trade System.
But even in the 1840s and 50s, Flores, Novato, Seguin, the ranches are still whole. The ranches are still there. Even Seguin comes back. After fighting against Texas and then against the United States in the war with Mexico, he comes back, becomes a county judge, becomes an organizer of the Democratic Party in San Antonio. He doesn't stay a so-called traitor, because most of the people knew that that was a story that was made up in order to run him out. But the thing I learned most in leaving Texas and going to New England to study the history of Texas, was that a mistake? I don't think so, because Texas history had become very ingrown. And when I first heard of Juan Seguin? It's when I was in New Haven, Connecticut. They didn't teach Juan Seguin in Henrietta, Texas. I can guarantee you that. They may have been teaching him in San Antonio, but not in Wichita Falls. I was taught by my school, by the movies, as I said, by the culture, that this was a race war, that this was an ethnic war. And the nadir of that, the worst time of that, was in the early 20th century. And that's the nadir of what happened to African Americans in this country, as they were pushed back from Reconstruction and back from full participation in the political system and down into third and fourth class citizenship. And that was going on with Tejanos and with Mexican Americans at the same time.
To our distinguished panelists, I'm going to call a pause there because, as you might recall, we still have more conversation to go with our Citizens Advisory Committee members, but we are now at time for our live stream, and so we want to thank everyone at home for joining us this evening and spending the time along with the Alamo Citizens Advisory Council to learn more about the history of the Battle of the Alamo through three lenses: perspectives, choices, and motivations. To our panelists, Dr. Dr. Gilberto Hinojosa, Dr. Bruce Winders, Dr. James Crisp, and Ernesto Rodriguez, curator of the Alamo. Thank you very much for your service and for your time this evening. Thank you so much.